I find it interesting that Jonah says to him, "Pick me up and throw me over, and then the sea will become calm." I wonder why Jonah just didn't say, "Let me just jump in." But the guys, they're on that ship, those seamen, I think that they are so remarkable because, you see, Jonah was not so concerned about these seamen's lives. But these seamen who did not know the living God were very concerned about Jonah's life, and they tried desperately to reach the shore. But they were working against the God of heaven. And so the storm grew even worse. And then they called out to the Lord and they said, "Oh Lord, do not punish us for throwing Jonah overboard. Don't punish us, Lord." They tried everything they could to save him, and nothing worked. And they picked Jonah up, and they threw him overboard, and immediately the storm ceased. It stopped its raging. It was totally calm. Can you imagine what those seamen felt? And they fell down and they worshiped the God of heaven and earth because they realized they had come face to face with a God who controls everything. And Jonah is sinking to the bottom of the sea. And then it said, "And God raised up a fish to swallow Jonah." And Jonah ends up in the belly of a great sea monster. We say whale, we're so used to it. Everybody thinks it's a whale, but the truth is the Bible doesn't say whale. All we know, it's a great fish. Well, our little Jonah is sitting in the belly of this large fish, and I am sure it is a tremendous surprise to him. But what we find here is a man who has come face to face with God. You see, he wanted to run from God. But now all of a sudden he realizes he cannot live without God. And he says, "I called out in my distress to the Lord." That's just the way we are. We want God to stay out of our business as long as we're in sin. And as soon as we get into trouble, we call out to him, and we're so relieved that he has not left us. "I called out in my distress," he said. "I felt like I had," in verse 4, he said, "I said, I have been expelled from thy sight. Nevertheless, I will look again towards thy holy temple." He says in verse 6, "But thou hast brought my life from the pit, O Lord." And in 9, "I will sacrifice to thee with the voice of thanksgiving, that which I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation is from the Lord." You see, I think he's had a chance to sort of think about what he said to God. I don't want to go to Nineveh. Now he's sitting in the belly of a large fish, and Nineveh does not look so bad. You see, Jonah was in great distress. First of all, he recognized and was quite relieved, I am sure, that God is all present. B, he recognized that God is all powerful. Isn't it interesting that everyone obeyed God but Jonah? The sea obeyed God. The fish obeyed God. The seamen obeyed God. Everything was obeying God, but Jonah wasn't obeying God. And now that he has seen how absolutely persistent God is, he realizes God is all-powerful. He recognized that he needed God. How in the world was he ever going to get out of the stomach of the fish? You see, he needed God. He could not live without him. He recognized that God was a God of compassion. Who would have thought of fish? Only God would have thought of fish. God's compassion saved Jonah. And lastly, he recognized that salvation is from the Lord and the Lord only. When we get to chapter 3, it's kind of a repeat. Let's go over this one more time now, Jonah. "And now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time." God of second chances. "Jonah, arise and go to Nineveh, the great city, and proclaim to it the proclamation which I am going to tell you." And Jonah arose, and he went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. Now, Nineveh was an exceedingly great city. 3 days it would take to walk around the city. And Jonah began to go through the city 1 day's walk, and he cried out and said, "Yet 40 days and Nineveh will be overthrown." And there you have your prophecy. Now, we don't know whether he said it 10 times or 1 time, but something was taking place in Nineveh, this great city, that made the people listen. A couple of things might have been going on. First of all, when those seamen came back to Joppa, they had quite a story to tell. And remember, news traveled verbally, vocally. So if something like that was going to take place, it would have spread and could easily have gotten to Nineveh. Jonah may have had a change of color in his skin. His skin could have been bleached out, and just the fact that he was there and his skin was so unusual, it could very well have said, you know, something, I was in the belly of a whale. Another thing, Nineveh had experienced 2 plagues in the last few years that had been devastating to the city, so they get the idea that perhaps God might be against them. And then there was a total eclipse of the sun. That doesn't happen very often, and these people were not astrologists. They didn't have the big telescopes to see what was really going on. All they knew that things were happening in the city that were frightening to them, that perhaps there was a God who was disciplining them. All we know is that Jonah told them that they were going to be destroyed, and they immediately accepted it. And it said right up to the king, all the way down to the animals, they put on sackcloth, which is just a sign of humility. And they fasted and they prayed to the living God. It was the largest revival that takes place in the Bible, barring none. Now think about it. We've got 600,000 people. Immediate repentance. And they fell on their knees and asked God's forgiveness. And an incredible thing took place. In part 3, the declaration of Jonah, God commanded Jonah to warn Nineveh of coming destruction. Jonah obeyed God and prophesied to Nineveh. Nineveh repented and turned from their wicked ways, and God relented concerning calamity. The Lord then reprimanded Jonah. And the destruction of Nineveh was avoided. And God did not destroy Nineveh in 40 days. You see, he relented. I have said before that judgment and destruction is God's abnormal behavior. He will do anything to avoid destruction. The displeasure of Jonah, and now we get into something quite unusual. You see, for you and me, if God would have sent us somewhere and we ended up seeing 600,000 people turn their lives over to God, I'll tell you, we would have it on the front page of every newspaper in the whole world. That would be thrilling. But remember where our Jonah is coming from. He hates the Ninevites. He hates Assyria. He is afraid of Assyria, and oh my goodness, now God is going to do them good. You see, his whole view of them is so messed up. He truly thought that God only loved Israel. And now he has to come to grips with the fact that God does indeed love the whole world. The displeasure of Jonah. Jonah complained about God's compassion. And it's kind of a funny little scene there. Jonah is saying, I knew you were like that, God. He's stamping his foot at God. You see, he wanted God's compassion. He just didn't want God's compassion on his enemies. And it's like he's arguing with God. I knew you were like that. I knew you were a compassionate God. And then Jonah concluded that life wasn't worth living. You see, he's gotten himself into a big depression right here. And he's sitting outside of Nineveh, and he's looking down at that city, and he's just whining, and he's so depressed and discouraged because God is acting like God is, loving and compassionate, and nothing like we human beings with our sin nature. And so Jonah says, life isn't even worth living. I would rather die. And there he is in the heat, and there is a very strong, hot wind. Now, I will tell you that this wind is a real wind in this area of the world. And it is a wind that is so hot and so dry that it almost can suffocate you. Animals and people run for shelter when this kind of wind comes whipping through the town because it is suffocating. And there is Jonah out there just about suffocating, and God brings up a leafy vine, and it is so large that it covers Jonah and gives him some shade. And yet Jonah continues to complain. And so the Lord removed the shelter by sending a worm. You see, all of nature is still obeying God. The vine obeys God, the worm obeys God, and Jonah is still pouting. And then Jonah complains about not having shelter. And at the end, God says this to Jonah, and should I not have compassion on Nineveh, the great city in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know the difference between their right and left hand, as well as many animals? What God is saying here is that there are 120,000 children and babies and little ones who are so little they don't know their right from their left. The weak ones, the animals, and he's saying, Jonah, don't you even care about those? Jonah, can you not consider the weak? That's the end. But I think what is so encouraging is that Jonah wrote the book. And that's encouraging because it tells me that Jonah had a change of heart.